The history of media studies begins in the 1920s or so. Harold Lasswell was a political scientist who wrote his dissertation on a content analysis of propaganda messages during World War I. This is his book. So, why is this study important, and how is it that the study of media has remained in place in universities even after 100 years? Well, unfortunately, it seems like that the sad truth is there's been World War I and World War II and Vietnam and Gulf and many wars, and propaganda, even though that name is no longer as much in fashion as it was 100 years ago, still remains a concern in some form or name or the other. But in the 1920s, this was the term by which the field of communication research knew its object of study. So Harold Lasswell was very interested in the role that propaganda played in World War I. And in World War I, the main medium of propaganda was the printed leaflet. Okay? And literally hundreds and thousands of leaflets had been dropped, usually by hot air balloon, behind enemy lines in Europe. And conversely, there were other attempts also made by the German side to persuade American soldiers and so on. So Lasswell brought to this phenomenon a certain amount of objectivity and systemacity. So he tried to analyze what kind of themes were prevalent in these messages and what their possible effect might have been. And in the 1920s and 30s, his methodology and his work obviously struck a chord, and as the United States moved towards the Second World War, he was invited to join several important projects in Washington, D.C., initiated by the government and the military, in order to study and guide propaganda and communications. So Lasswell went on to write several books on propaganda and communication, and many of his ideas were used during the Second World War. But soon after the Second World War ended, the term propaganda itself went out of fashion. And it's understandable because it's easier to call what the opposite side is doing propaganda. But increasingly, as the methods that Lasswell and others had developed started to be used for other purposes and contexts as well, the more neutral term communication or mass communication began to become more prevalent. So the main contribution of Lasswell, apart from bringing in a certain amount of coherence and legitimacy to the study of mass communication, is a phrase known as the Lasswell Model. Okay? So this is just a simple statement that he coined in the 1940s when he was working on all these US government projects. And the Lasswell model is a summary of the entire mass communication process. And it's useful because it marks out the different areas of research that one could do in media studies. Okay? So very simply, what the Lasswell's model says is who says what, in which channel, to whom, with what effect. Okay? So naturally, the concern in much of the research those days was on the question of effect, both from the point of view of concern, how could the enemy use propaganda to make us vulnerable, and also out of self-interest, how could we use propaganda to, say, demoralize our enemies. So effect was the main concern of a lot of the early mass communication research that Lasswell and others did, borrowing tools from psychology, political science, sociology, and so on. But the useful thing to remember about Lasswell's model is that it reminds us that there's a lot more to understand and study about media than just the question of whether the media actually have effects on us. Okay, so that is a question that often comes up when there's some act of violence, like a horrible school shooting or even something like bullying, and inevitably we speculate whether it's the media, like a violent video game or some violent movie, which perhaps influenced somebody to do it. Those kind of questions just go on, chicken and egg. But there are a lot of other things too that can be investigated in the study of media. So, to give us a broad overview of the field of media studies using Lasswell's model, who says what to whom, in which channel, with what effect, let's just break down each of these words really quickly, because that will also give us a sense of some of the kinds of questions that media scholars have asked since the time of the World Wars. Who? So, who refers to the media as institutions, as producers? So, to this day, when we talk about, say, why the media function the way they do, the tension between, say, creativity in the media and corporate control, questions of censorship, at the government censorship or even in-house, corporate censorship, when we want to know why, say, newspaper editors or social media giants decide to censor some content and promote others. Those are all questions which pertain to what Lasswell would call the who stage, the media institution, the media production part. Says what? Okay. This is probably the part of media that's most familiar to us as consumers and as critics. Says what refers to media as texts, okay, media messages. So it could be newspaper stories, it could be tweets, Facebook posts, movies, advertising, photography, any kind of analysis that we do of media messages in themselves pertains to the says what question. And so questions of media bias and representation, for example. So if we want to know if say a news channel has a particular political bias, Lasswell's model sort of gives us the conceptual map to go in with the right tools, known as content analysis, to try and see objectively if we can determine whether there is bias, say, in that news channel or that magazine and so on. The third part, in which channel, pertains to issues of technology and distribution, and a lot of information theory and engineering related work has also sort of come into the field in some ways, but that is takes us into a slightly different terrain. And then the last two, to whom and with what effect, are probably the most intriguing and important aspects of the whole mass communication process. Many scholars from the time of Lasswell have been concerned with this question of media effects. Okay? How do media really cause a particular kind of change in behavior or attitude? And there's been a lot of studies done right from the 1930s or so, using methods in psychology and sociology and so on. Researchers have done experiments, they've done surveys, and obviously, like anything in the realm of human behavior, it's very hard to pinpoint causality. But all the same, there have been some very useful studies which give us a sense of both the limits of media influence as well as the inevitable issue, which is that media do have influence as well. So in the next video, we will look at a couple of important studies and approaches in what has come to be called the effects tradition, which is media research using social science tools, which took place, say, from the 1930s or so till the 1970s. Well, it's still done, to answer the question mainly of media influence.